Well, good morning and welcome. I know there's still a lot of people in the coffee hour who are chatting and doing coffee hour. Excuse me. I want to be sensitive to our speaker's time today, so I thought I'd get started, and then as people trickle in, they'll catch up. So thank you for being here today as we begin this new series. It's my pleasure and honor to say a few words about our speaker for the next several weeks by way of introduction. The Reverend Helen Marshall is an Anglican priest serving as chaplain of St. Ursula's in Bern, Switzerland. Originally from Cheshire in the north of England, she worked previously in the UK as a parish priest and a university chaplain. For many years, she has been involved in leading retreats and teaching courses on prayer. In fact, many of you will probably remember Helen from a quiet day she led for us last year on the theme of solitude and community. Helen is married to David, who is also an Anglican priest, and they have 2 grown-up sons. I am delighted that she has agreed to lead us in this 4-week series on the English mystics, a group of spiritual and devotional writers from the 14th century with much to teach us in the 21st. And as you can see, technology allows us to bring Helen in from Switzerland. I think it's something like 2 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon or something like that over there. So she's already been through her Sunday morning routine. But technology obviously also brings with it its own challenges. So we'll no doubt run into those as we go through these next 4 weeks. But we'll do our best to avoid them. And I do appreciate your patience as we navigate this new format of Sunday formation. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Reverend Helen Marshall.
Thank you, Nicholas. Can you hear me? Good. Well, it's very good to be with you again. Some of you, I think, as Nicholas said, may have been in the quiet day I led last year, and I may have met some of you in person because David and I did come to the church quite a few years ago now when David was working at Duke in North Carolina. You've been in our prayers in recent times because we are aware that you suffered very much a lot of devastation from the hurricane last year, and I hope all is going well in the rebuilding in your church community. So these next 4 sessions, we're thinking about praying with the English mystics. What I'm going to do is give you some input. There'll be time for questions, but also I hope some time for silence and reflection and sharing together. I hope you all have been given a handout for this session today. So first, a general introduction to the English mystics. If we want guidance and inspiration in the life of prayer, we are perhaps unlikely to have our first thought to look back to the 14th century, to those perhaps slightly odd characters that are known collectively as the English mystics. But they can still speak to us today, and there's much that we can receive from them. There are immense spiritual riches for us to tap into in the past, and we're all the poorer if we're not aware of our Christian spiritual tradition. I think it's a real shame when people only tend to read books on prayer and the spiritual life that came out recently. We're missing out if we don't read the classics which have stood the test of time. In particular, 4 of the so-called English mystics are worth getting to know. And although these 4 Christians lived in a very different context from us, they have much to teach us in our noisy, frenetic world today. They remind us of the call to pray, to make space for God, for silence, and to be single-minded in seeking after him. So who are these English mystics? Well, probably the most well-known, of course, is Mother Julian of Norwich, and we'll be focusing on her on another week. There's certainly a renewed interest in Mother Julian these days. I first read her book, Revelations of Divine Love, when I was at university in Norwich. So I felt I must read her and go to find out more about her living in Norwich. Another of these 14th century writers is unnamed, but he, and it probably was a he, wrote the little book, The Cloud of Unknowing, which I also read for the first time, aged 18 at university. And it made a very strong impression upon me then, and I've continued to reread it over the years. The Cloud of Unknowing is also quite popular these days, and many of you may have read it. The other two writers we're going to look at, Richard Rolle and Walter Hilton, are perhaps unlikely to be familiar names to you. So these characters were all called together the English mystics, but they can't be said to form a school of English spirituality, really. They are the writings of independent minds. Though we can tell when we read through The Cloud of Unknowing and Walter Hilton that they had both read Richard Rolle's book. They quote him, sometimes they refer to him, not usually that approvingly, in fact. And we know that Walter Hilton had also read The Cloud of Unknowing, and Mother Julian had probably read Walter Hilton. So there is some kind of connectivity between them. There are differences in their approach, and we will be looking at some of those differences in these sessions, but there are also many similarities. Each one wrote as an individual for individuals, as solitaries for fellow solitaries. They all wrote in English rather than in Latin, and they all write with a good deal of personal testimony and experience. Before saying any more, I think it's also worth us thinking about the time in which they wrote, 14th century England. It was not an easy time. England was at war with France, what is now called the 100 Years' War, between 1337 and 1453. It was also a time of devastation and suffering brought on by the bubonic plague, or often called the Black Death, which swept through Europe, and especially in England in 1348-9 and 1361. The Black Death reduced the population by at least 1/3 and maybe even 1/2. So when we think about COVID, we think about how awful COVID has been, it's nothing on the Black Death. So just imagine living in 14th century England or Europe. There were also a lot of instability socially, and there were many revolts, particularly the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. So it was a time of instability and suffering. It wasn't an easy time. Now, none of this trauma is reflected directly in the writings of these authors, but I think it's important for us to be aware that they wrote their books about faith and prayer and silence when all these challenging circumstances were going on around them. All four of these writers had a profound desire for God and an awareness of God, which they expressed in different ways. And we're going to look at a different writer in each of these four sessions, beginning in a moment with Richard Rolle. But first, by way of introduction, I'd like us to look at one short quotation from each writer and just to ponder which of those quotations resonates most with us in our own experience of prayer and the spiritual life. Which one do we most warm to? And then it may be illuminating to see later whether this is, when we learn more about these different writers, whether we still warm the most to that quotation. So in the handout, you should see there 4 different short quotations, and I'd like you to take 2 or 3 minutes to just look at those yourself, to read them through slowly and quietly to yourself, and think through which of those quotations most speaks to you. Okay, perhaps what you could do now is just turn to your neighbor and share with them which of those quotations most resonates with you, and listen to their comments in return, just for a couple of minutes. Okay, if we come back together again, just be quite interesting. How many people found the first quotation they most warmed to? Put your hands up. Let's see. Got a few people there. What about the second one? Okay. Yeah. The third one, contemplation is a holy idleness and a most busy rest. Yeah. And what about the final one? The outcome and purpose of our prayers. Oh, wow, look at that. Is we should be united with our Lord and like him in everything. Well, you might be interested to know that the first quotation is Richard Rolle, who we're thinking about today. The second quotation is from The Cloud of Unknowing. The third one is from Walter Hilton. And the fourth one is from Mother Julian of Norwich. So let's turn to our first writer, our first author. He did write at the earliest, he was the earliest writer, Richard Rolle. He was born around 1300 in Yorkshire. He died in 1349, most possibly of the Black Death. He studied in Oxford, but he left before he graduated to become a hermit back in Yorkshire. In fact, the tale is that he literally ran away from home as a young man, become a hermit. And as a hermit, he committed himself to a solitary life of prayer. Now, it's perhaps worth registering the difference between a hermit and an anchorite or anchoress, as Mother Julian was. An anchorite or anchoress lived in one place, they never moved about, whereas hermits were free to roam and move house. And some of them did other jobs. Hermits could be lighthouse keepers, or builders of roads, or someone who collected for charity. Usually someone who was a solitary would have learnt the discipline of living in a community first and followed a community rule, like the rule of St. Benedict. Although that wasn't true with Richard Rolle. He threw himself into the hermit life before such a preparation. So why did people choose to become hermits or anchorites or anchoresses? Well, I find it quite interesting. I read a passage, it's in the introduction to Richard Rolle's book, The Fire of Love, suggesting reasons why people might choose the solitary life. And it's quite illuminating and quite humorous at points. So I thought I'd read this to you. Various reasons have prompted men to retire into a hermitage. The secular priest, aiming at spiritual perfection, might seek it here after years of apostolic labor in a parish. Others might use it as a temporary pick-me-up, living a life of prayer alone for a period and then returning to parochial work, refreshed and refurbished. There was nothing to prevent them from retiring again into solitude for further strengthening and more service. Some used their hermit vocation as a protest against prevailing clerical laxity, seeking by their own particular witness to challenge others to renewed piety. The motives for heeding a call to solitude were many, but there were simpler, more human reasons too, to account for the popularity of the solitary life. Medieval life was intolerably public. Towns and villages huddled together for mutual protection and support, and there were very few human functions that could be performed without some eye seeing. To mention but one matter which is probably different from the circumstances of any reader of this book, everybody slept in the same room. Beds, where they existed, could take up to 6 people. Night attire was unknown, and one either slept in one's clothes or in none at all. One can let one's imagination rove widely over this single fact. It will not go far beyond the bounds of possibility. Nor did the parish churches offer a haven of quiet. In addition to their daily religious use, they served as the medieval equivalent of a town hall, come community centre, come parish hall, and within the hallowed walls many different activities were conducted. Justice was administered, courts were convened, contracts made, plays staged, church ales held, and even fairs were accommodated either inside the building or in the churchyard. The whole of life was unbelievably crude and rough for the common man. To sensitive souls, the only escape into any sort of privacy must often have seemed an anchor hold somewhere, or a hermitage, or a religious house. It is understandable that solitaries were numbered by the hundred in the 14th century. So that gives us a bit of an insight into what it might have been like to live in medieval times in England, and perhaps we would have been wanting to run away to a religious house or become a solitary. So Richard Rolle. Well, Richard Rolle was the only one of the 14th century mystics who was famous in his lifetime. And he was, in fact, the most widely read of these writers until the Reformation. It's interesting that probably now he's the least well read of the four. It shows how writers of all kinds, even writers on prayer and spiritual life, can go in and out of fashion. Richard Rolle mainly wrote for and about hermits, and the most well-known of his books is called The Fire of Love. It's not a systematic work. He writes from and about his own experience. It's rather an untidy sort of book, full of repetition. But it does have lots of joy, warmth, and energy. The emphasis in his book is on the need to love God. There must be a serious intention to long continually for the love of God, he says. God may grant us visions, allow us to experience heavenly things, but it's he who grants the vision. There is a great stress on joy. And he speaks of the joy and the wonder of contemplation being beyond words to describe. So he tries with words like intoxicating, melting, and absorbing. His main premise is that he believes God wants to be experienced in very tangible ways. And he speaks of warmth, sweetness, and song. So I'm going to read a couple of short quotations. I was sitting in a certain chapel, delighting in the sweetness of prayer or meditation, when suddenly I felt within myself an unusually pleasant heat. At first I wondered where it came from, but it was not long before I realized it was from the Creator himself. He also speaks of a conscious and incredibly sweet warmth which kindled me, and I knew the infusion and understanding of heavenly spiritual sounds, sounds which pertain to the song of eternal praise and to the sweetness of unheard of melody. I wonder if any of us can identify in any way with what he is saying. Have we had any times when we've had almost a physical, tangible sense of God's presence, a warmth, a sweetness, even a sense of music? Makes me think of Wesley's experience when he talks about my heart was strangely warmed. And perhaps many modern charismatics would identify with some of what Rolle says. He seems to assume in his book that if we love God enough, we will have such intense experiences. He says, the one who loves very greatly burns with unquenchable blaze and is filled with heavenly sweetness. The perfect man, he says, will experience the sweetness of heavenly contemplation, to be taken hold of and pass through the joy of loving God to spiritual song, through contemplation to heavenly music. It seems that he seems to be saying that if we follow God faithfully, we will experience his nearness and joy in a very tangible way. And Rolle, perhaps like some modern charismatics, is very zealous to share his own experience with other people. And he expects that others will have a similar experience to him. He says, if you really sought to acquire a taste for heavenly things and studied to be kindled with love for God, there can be no doubt the same delightful sweetness would flow abundantly into you. Now, I wonder how we might react to those words, to his experience, but also his expectation that others will have the same experience that he has. It may perhaps stir some questions for us, because what about those faithful Christians, those who are faithful to God, who seek him daily in prayer and contemplation, who go through desert experiences or times of darkness? And of course, there are many writers on prayer throughout the centuries who speak about these dark experiences and how God can work deeply in us through those times. But there's no room for that kind of experience in Richard Roll's writing. There's no expectation of a dark night or any kind of suffering in prayer. Occasionally, he will talk about toil or labor in the spiritual life, but his own experiences all seem to be very positive and very joyful, and that's what he seems to expect of anyone else. Some of the later mystics, including the mystics we're going to look at in these sessions, criticize Richard Roll because they see he seems to be making the sensation of loving God more significant than loving God himself. Is he fixated on an experience rather than on God's self? And maybe there's something for us to ponder. How important to us are our positive sensations and experiences in prayer? And do we expect other people to have the same experiences that we do? On the other hand, we could turn that round and say, well, maybe sometimes some of us as Western Christians are perhaps over-cerebral in our approach to spiritual things, and maybe we have something to learn from Richard Roll. It's interesting that Eastern Christians from the Eastern Church, tend to be a bit more sympathetic because they expect mystical and perhaps even physical experiences related to, for example, saying the Jesus Prayer. But maybe, even if we have some hesitations about Richard Roll's teaching, his main concern could be summed up in the phrase, love God. And we can't really argue with that. Perhaps, too, his emphasis on the joy of faith can be inspiring. For the man who loves Christ ardently and rejoices and sings in the sheer delight of that love is the one who lives secure and sure. Now, I wonder if any of you have any questions or any comments or anything you'd like to share yourself from, if you warm or you don't warm to what Richard Roll has said, then I invite you to say something to us all.
That, okay. Okay.
Read your paper.
It's just that I responded positively to the questions that were raised, that his preaching of his experience should be that of everyone. I have a problem with that.
Yeah.
I have a question. How in this time, when he's a hermit, supposedly living by himself somewhere, does he have all the facility to write and write and write, the paper, the ink, the whatever? I mean, it just seems peculiar.
Well, that's interesting. I know that, for example, Gillian of Norwich, when we come to talk about her, she was an anchoress. So it wasn't that they had no contact with other people. It was just that, you know, they spent most of their time on their own in prayer, which probably in some regards was quite a luxury. If we heard what it was like in medieval times, I think it would have been very tempting personally to go and be a hermit or be an anchoress in that sense. But they weren't completely, it wasn't that they had no contact with anybody.
Sarah?
Any other questions?
Well, I'm one of those people who went through, you know, has had a number of those dark nights of the soul. So, yeah, I relate to what you wrote there about how there's not a lot of room for that in Richard Roll. But there's always a kernel of something that remains there regardless. It doesn't mean that I, you know, stop loving God, but I just feel disconnected from God. And I also, you know, when you put the quote about there must be serious intention to long continually for the love of God. I love God, but I don't always understand the love of God returning to me.
Is that we don't always have the feeling of the love of God, but we just have to keep, it's faith really. We have to keep sort of offering ourselves and being there, and in a way trust that God's love is around us, and even when we can't see it, when it might be dark, and that's part of the kind of the faith needed to be a contemplative, I suppose, because it's part of it is just the being available in the silence for God, even when you might feel nothing. And that Richard Roll talks more about sensations and feelings, but some of the other writers we're going to talk about, you know, the discipline in a sense of being there in that cloud of unknowing when you may not feel anything, but you believe that God is present and you keep going.
Right, exactly.
Did anyone notice any connections between what we've been talking about this morning and, if you've already been to church, the Father Edward's sermon this morning? The flame being kindled, and a lot of that language is very consonant with what you hear in Richard Roll. In fact, the language, as you were describing it, that's what occurred to me, that little kernel that we have to find, and that ember that we can fan into flame.
It's also the last line of the Micah reading.
Mm-hmm.
That's, you know, just one of the core principles of my life.
Right. Yeah, there's that beautiful reading from Micah. What does the Lord require of you? Any other questions, comments? Yes?
It just popped into my head that the scripture about not being able to tolerate people who are lukewarm. Let them be really cold, or let them be really hot, but not lukewarm, seems to fit a little with
Let's not
this.
be the church in Laodicea. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I you know, I've written on St. John of the Cross in the past, and I've long, you know, thought about the dark night kind of experiences, and had you know, that's resonated with me. But in recent times, I've also thought a lot about joy, and just looking through the Bible and all the references to joy. You know, Jesus saying, "I've come that my joy may be in you, and your joy may be complete." There is so much about joy in the scriptures, and so that's made me, you know, there is something that we may not be joyful all the time, but there is a call to discover the joy that is there for us in God. And maybe that's Richard Roll has he's perhaps fortunate enough to have an experience of that a lot of the time. But maybe there is something for us all to think about. that perhaps there are disciplines that can help us to taste more of the joy of God that is there for us. And perhaps we can build those disciplines into our lives.
Another question.
Hi, I think it's more with me a comment. The common thread that I noticed when you brought that up, I thought that was a great thing to say. The common thread that I noticed between this morning's sermon, which was absolutely lovely, and this, our teaching now, is that the common thread that I see is the importance of finding your own why, your own sense of purpose, and digging deep and finding what that is, and allowing God to work through you in regards to what your real sense of purpose is. And, kind of along those lines, like what is your why? What is your natural, raw talent that you feel God has given you? And how can you allow God to work through you and reach others in that regard? And I don't know, I think that's interconnected with both. Thanks.
Thank you. That's it. Well, I put together a sheet here for further reflection, which I thought, you can take away with you to use afterwards. Yeah, I mean, the idea of reading these writers is praying with the English mystics. So hopefully the idea is not just for us to think about a few things, but to lead us deeper into reflection and to help us pray. So I've given you a few sort of questions there, but to think about what our experience is of God have been in the past, and whether we have had those kind of more tangible experiences, or if not, what kind of images will we use? What kind of words or images will we use of our experience of God? And then thinking about how we react to other people when they speak about their experiences of God, which may be different from ours. But then maybe just looking at our own spiritual journey, perhaps that's something we can do during this coming week, to think about times when we have sensed that God is very present to us. How do we sense that? How do we know that? Is it in our gut? Is it, how do we know? And what's happened in the times when we have been through that dark night of the soul, or that time when God has felt absent? And what have we learned through both those kinds of experiences? And maybe, to sort of draw a map of our spiritual life can sometimes be quite illuminating, and can help us think back over the past, think about where we are now, think about how we will cope with things coming at us in the future. And just to learn from one another. We put our experiences of God we try to put them in words. And sometimes it's not easy to put them in words. And that's what some of these mystics are saying, really, that find the words is difficult, because we're talking about God. And but it can be helpful to share with each other, as long as we're patient and gracious with each other, to listen what our experiences have been.
Thank you so very much. Oh, I'm in front of the wrong speaker. Thank you so very much, Helen, for this wonderful presentation. I just noticed that the clock on the computer here may be making some people nervous. It's not actually 11:13. It's just a few minutes till 11. So it's just so that you can rest at ease. But thank you. Any other questions or comments for Helen before we let her go? And you have wonderful questions to think about in the week ahead. One more quick question. Sure.
I just wonder where in Switzerland she is.
Oh, she's in Bern. Yes. All right. Well, thank you very much, Helen.
It's a pleasure. Very good to be with you. And I look forward to being with you next week.